Now, meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping presided over an informal BRICS leaders meeting on Friday ahead of the G20 Summit. Xi and the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India and South Africa met to discuss international, political and economic issues. The BRICS leaders agreed that unity and coordination are key to sustainable development. Xi also urged the BRICS countries to promote the peaceful settlement of regional disputes. The leaders will have a formal summit in Xiamen, China later this year. Well, let's get to you more on today's events at the summit. I'm joined live from Hamburg by our correspondent, Guy Henderson. Guy, indeed, it seems it was a rather eventful start to the G20. Just talk us through the highlights of day one.
Yeah, you're just, I think, seeing live pictures, or have just seen live pictures of US President Donald Trump arriving at the Elbphilharmonie here in Hamburg for an evening of classical music with other G20 leaders. At his side, interestingly, was Melania Trump, the First Lady. She, for a period today, had apparently been unable to get out of her hotel room because of the scale of the protests happening here. Police still struggling to get those protests and instances of violence under control here. They'd appealed for extra police officers to be drafted in to try and bring that violence under control. Earlier in the day, as you'd already mentioned, was perhaps the most hotly anticipated bilateral meeting of this entire gathering, and that was the first face-to-face meeting between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. We haven't had a great deal out of that meeting directly. I think we're expecting a briefing from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who might outline a little more of it. We did see them shake hands briefly in the day, where they both exchanged pleasantries, saying that it was an honour to meet each other, delighted to meet each other. But we haven't had much more out of that actual meeting. Obviously, the context here is that this was a US candidate who had promised closer ties with Russia, but in Poland, in the build-up to this summit, had some pretty strong words for Russia, particularly when it came to Ukraine and Syria. And you've just broken that news on air just before I came on about US officials, according to the Associated Press, confirming a ceasefire in Syria agreed by the US and Russia, which will kick in on the 9th of June at around midday. Obviously, we've heard these these kind of commitments before. Whether it will stand this time, we'll have to wait and see. Perhaps the context is slightly different now after what appears to be a Gulf effort to try and clamp down on some of the more extreme elements within rebel groups. But as I say, more details still emerging on the exact specifics of that ceasefire.
And indeed, the timing of this G20 summit, it certainly just puts the spotlight on some key global issues that are currently dominating conversations, clearly within the summit, but also outside on the streets of Hamburg. As you mentioned, the scale of the protests we're seeing this year. Just tell us more about that.
Well, as I say, the small protests still going on, and I think that's been part of the difficulty for police, is that their pockets, they're coming and going, they're quite fast moving. And so therefore even this huge number of police officers have struggled to get it under control. In terms of the tensions inside the room, two main issues I think that have dominated certainly the media coverage in the build-up, and that we've got a little bit more detail on now. Firstly, on trade issues, obviously the US administration coming to this summit with a sort of more protectionist agenda perhaps. We heard Angela Merkel talking about how one of the key negotiating points for the negotiators, perhaps even through the night and into Saturday over the next 24 hours, is going to be steel over capacity. It sounds a bit technical, but that is basically what she's talking about there, is subsidized Chinese companies selling their steel at a very cheap price on the international market. That's undercutting American companies and other companies, and that is one of the main motivations, or seen as one of the main motivations for the US considering one of its first big solid protectionist moves, which will be to bring in steel tariffs. So it appears that is a key sticking point here. The other one, of course, climate change. No agreement there yet, it doesn't seem. some of the draft text that we've seen, an early draft text had talked about the US perhaps accepting a draft which spoke about accepting a global effort to reduce emissions while at the same time respecting the right to economic growth. We don't know what the final agreement will be there, though. Certainly, a particularly tense G20 summit here.
And of course, after today, being a rather eventful day in itself, what's on the agenda for tomorrow?
Well, a bit more of an Africa agenda, you might be pleased to hear, on the final day of this G20. Throughout the German presidency of this G20 over the last few months, there has been a real Africa focus. What's known particularly as the Compact with Africa, and that is basically a scheme whereby the G20 are trying to coordinate with African leaders, many of whom are here at the G20 as well, to try and work with them, encourage them to carry out various reforms which might make in private sector investment into Africa more attractive for European firms and G20 firms. Now there is a security perspective to that, of course, because particularly Germany and Europe are faced to their southern borders along the North Africa with an insecure environment, a refugee crisis, the threat of terrorism, and so it is very much seen as being in their interest to try and bring, in the long term at least, some sort of stability through private sector investment, through this compact with Africa. Some criticism of it as well, though. We've heard civil society groups and charities say that there's still not enough consultation with African countries, that this is still very much serving the interests of the investors rather than the recipient countries, but that will be the focus on Saturday.
Indeed, we'll be looking forward to that. And as we can just see there, well, thanks first of all very much to Guy Henderson, that update there following events from Hamburg at the G20 Summit.